Great, thank you
Mhm.
everybody for joining this evening. So, as I've just said, the purpose of this is really to sort of hopefully encourage some of you to that may not be considering classical studies to do classical studies, but in general, this is just for anyone who's interested in classical studies. So, I thought I'd pick on something a bit more general, which is looking at gladiators in Pompeii. I have rather overdone it for anyone who's actually attended one of my talks before. I tend to overdo it a little bit. I thought I'd quickly run through, like, I want to primarily focus on Pompeii itself, but a little bit about the origins or the perceived origins of gladiatorial events. So, much of the sort of debate, and there is quite a bit of debate about it, does relate to the literary sources. And the literary sources do tend to have quite a heavy weight in relation to how we understand the past. And this is a reference that comes from Nicias Damascus that suggests that the gladiatorial events essentially comes from the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans is a tribal grouping, not that were sort of competitive with the Romans. And in this case, now, admittedly, Nicias Damascus is writing, the latter part of the first century BC, early part of the first century AD. So he's not going very far back into the past himself, but he is looking back into the past, and he talks about them as being part of festivals and the theaters, and even something that you could do in terms of a dining event. So another reference here, again, Italy first century, looking back into the past, talking about in Capua, but certainly talk about gladiatorial events taking place in Campania. Campania is the main region in which Pompeii is located. Talks about the people of Capua, as I said, but also refers to dining events. Now, these two individuals might be using the same sort of sources in relation to each other. Livy, a historian, well known and seems to be, for most people's terms, a credible source, again refers to the companions and refers to that one of the reasons why a particular type of gladiator, no, Samnite gladiator, is because of competition between the people in Campania and the Samnites, but again makes reference to feasts. So that's the literary source. So most early stuff that you look at in terms of gladiators will talk about originating from the Etruscans. Now, there is some measure of archaeological source, and this is where I know Cheryl's been, is in Paestum. And Paestum is, again, a settlement in the area of Campania, further south than Pompeii, and it's a Greek settlement, and it has some wonderful Greek temples here. Here's three of them, or two of them, I should say, but there's three large temples. They also have a Roman amphitheater. So it was originally a Greek settlement. It gets taken over by the Oscans. The Oscans were peoples that settled in Pompeii too, and eventually gets taken over, I think, by the Etruscans, but the Oscans do seem to have still quite a strong community. The amphitheater is not as impressive as the one in Pompeii, but it only dates back to the 50 BC, so it's a relatively recent thing in comparison to Pompeii. So what they have here is these sort of frescoes coming from a burial area, the necropolis. And this looks like what we could interpret as being two gladiators. So this would fit in with some of the association we've seen the literary source and talking about the Etruscans, is that gladiatorial events were associated with funerary aspects. And that seems to be a fairly consistent thing that we do see with the literary source, but at least in this case, look, coming from further south and an Oscan background, this goes back to the third century BC. Another example of that, which again might be associated with funerary rituals, but then again, might not possibly. It's just because in the funerary context that that association is made. So the point I'm trying to make here, I suppose, ultimately is these are gladiatorial events, or to suggest that they are gladiatorial events and single combat between individuals, taking place in the third century BC, long before the building of solid amphitheaters. So that would seem to fit in that obviously gladiatorial events took place before the invention of the amphitheater. Looking a little bit further north, the city of Rome, this reference relating back into 264 BC, again, we'll see the likes of Livy and those individuals looking into the past, is gladiatorial events took place, reiterating some aspects I've just mentioned about that funerary aspect that taking place in the Forum Boarium in Rome, and these seem to be associated with funerary aspects. Little bit later on, again, we see funerary games taking place associated with gladiatorial events, but also taking place in the Forum in the city of Rome too. So there does seem to be that link between funerary aspects and events taking place in the forum. So when we are thinking about gladiatorial events, we shouldn't necessarily always be thinking about it takes place in an actual amphitheater. So although we will all have seen the likes of Gladiator, the film, and we see the impressive amphitheaters there, it doesn't necessarily mean that gladiatorial events took place just in that particular location. And part of one of the things I want to try and talk to you today is to show in many ways how visual gladiators were within Pompeian society, I suppose. I'm not going to go into massive detail about the different types of gladiators. Simple reason for that is because I'll confuse myself and I'll never remember which is which. But it just shows in some ways, even those people who are experts in gladiators, not necessarily very clear in relation to when we're looking at depictions of gladiators. So moving into back to Pompeii, which is where I wanted to focus on. This is the Forum in Pompeii. This was developed around 4th century BC. The arrow is pointing as the Forum is just in case people don't necessarily know what the Forum in Pompeii looks like, at least from the air. Um, and the location and proximity in Pompeii itself, the settlement or majority of it, 2/3 has been excavated, parts of it have been excavated, but the Forum is a central area of Pompeii. So is there any evidence for gladiatorial events taking place in the Forum in Pompeii? We have this quite elaborate inscription. Unfortunately, this inscription has been now lost, which is one of those sort of frustrating things. But we can see here this individual is talking about the games of Apollo in the Forum. And in this case, he talks about there were gladiatorial events taking place in the 1st century AD in the Forum in Pompeii, but also in the area of the amphitheater. So to reiterate that point, at least we have the evidence that suggests that there were gladiatorial events taking place, and not only in the amphitheater, but elsewhere in Pompeii, and one of those locations is the Forum. So the Temple of Apollo is the area here that I'm just pointing, that you can see with the arrow here, is very close to the Forum, which might explain why there's a reference to gladiatorial events taking place in the possible Forum area. But at least it is tangible evidence does suggest that gladiatorial events did take place in that location. Now, this is a slight digression, but just to show in some ways, I know the inscription itself has been lost, but to show this is sort of a real individual. This is a funerary area outside the Porta Norcia, which is the gate, and it refers to one of the Claudi families, which is just made reference to there. So this is just showing what this individual does exist, and this is the location in which the funerary aspect has been found. The other place that I would suggest, and as mentioned in other literary source, but not in Pompeii, is that you could imagine the gladiatorial events could have taken place in the theatres. Now, the large theatre, the 2nd century BC one mentioned that I'm showing here, has a capacity of around 5,000 individuals, and it's quite close to the Forum in Pompeii as well. It's an open space, so there's no reason why it wouldn't necessarily have been availed of in terms of gladiatorial events if people wish to do so. Next to that is another theatre, the smaller theatre, or the Odeon, which is a smaller capacity and built a little bit later on. But it too could have been used for gladiatorial events because, it is an area where people could see things. So we have the Forum, it could have possible in the theatre. I will come back to this a little bit later on, which you'll see a little bit late, the reason why I'm doing that as I move through the actual talk itself. So this is where the Forum is, and this is where the theatre district is. So they're not actually that far away from each other. Now, I did mention about the association with funerary aspects. It could have been gladiatorial combat taking place where there are various tombs, and these are some of the tombs in the exterior of Pompeii itself. All these major tombs are outside Pompeii because it was illegal to bury individuals within the city walls, and these were the more impressive individuals who tried to emphasize their ancestry and their importance within society by having these elaborate tombs. So there's possibility there might be some sort of gladiatorial events here, possibly. Also was mentioned that they're taking place in the dining room. So what we have here is a house of the Casa de Tiberius Valens, excavated early 1913 and 1915. this is one of those sort of interesting dwellings because I did a previous talk about the bombings of Pompeii in 1943, and hence put that up on the top. Is much of the facade itself has been lost. The location of this is along this main road. I'm going to try and see if I can do the drawing one just in case you're not aware of this. This is one of the main streets in Pompeii. Obviously, it's more straight than the line I'm doing there, the Via della Badanza. So it's located there. The amphitheater, for those who don't know it, is located here in Pompeii. So this is what it would have perhaps looked like before it was destroyed in 1943 by the bombing. And there was various frescoes, and on either side of what there's promotions to gladiatorial events, which I think is quite interesting. But the point is, in terms of looking in terms of the dining room, is if we look through the doorway into the dwelling itself, what survives nowadays, you might look into you can see in the distance, you can see a sort of checkerboard pattern. That is the triclinium. It's a dining room. So it might be, in that case, there may have been small gladiatorial events taking place there. I'm not saying there's any evidence in this particular dwelling, but it's just a suggestion. And this is a nice sort of depiction that coming from 1880 of a gladiatorial event. I don't know if anyone's seen the video, not the video, well, probably is now on video. The Spartacus video series, you can see that they do have gladiatorial events taking place within the household. So it's just to give you an indication that all these different locations that gladiatorial events could have taken place, and we shouldn't just firmly associate with the amphitheater. Um, there was clearly a lot of criticism of gladiatorial events. This is coming from Tacitus. You can see he's very dismissive. He doesn't like the idea of the people passion for actors, gladiators, and horses, and people putting this aside in relation to the noble arts. So, given this is coming from Tacitus, it makes a suggestion that this is really going to be gladiatorial events is more of a greater interest for those lower echelons of society, but that's clearly not the case, which is what I'll try to illustrate as we move through the talk in Pompeii. So this is the amphitheater in Pompeii. The arrow which I've put here is just showing you the entrance to the amphitheater, but this is the modern day entrance into the amphitheater. The other thing I want to say, I've already showed you the location of that. It's in sort of the very far end of Pompeii, more sort of less built up area, the less domesticated areas of Pompeii. So they're taking advantage of that. You may be able to get an indication of this from looking at this image, that it's actually lower than the normal area around it. So they did dig this area out and took advantage of the spoil of that to try and build up the banks around the area of the amphitheater. The main point I want to show in relation to this is the modern entrance going into Pompeii. So for those of you who may have been with me in relation to going to Pompeii, but this is how you will normally greet the amphitheater in Pompeii if you take that entrance into Pompeii itself. This is a false impression as to how people of Pompeii would have actually seen the amphitheater. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have been able to get here, but this is not how people would first normally see the amphitheater in Pompeii. Again, going back into my sort of interest in Pompeii during the Second World War, this is after the Second World War. We can see sort of looks like American troops after Italy gets taken over by the Allies, walking into seeing the amphitheater in Pompeii. You can see to some extent that, you know, when I show you the earlier slide, some of the reconstitution that's taken place of the amphitheater there. Um, so the point I'm trying to say is if you look at the amphitheater as we see it here, there is no entrance. So this is where you go from the modern element into it. So as I said, you get a false impression. I want to try and make a few points in relation to how people would view the amphitheater. Now, I did say I wanted to emphasize this on the people of Pompeii, but I also think it's important that, you know, we're not just talking about the people of Pompeii, but we're also talking about the people surrounding area, but also people going a little bit further afield, you know, the wider towns that are surrounding Pompeii as well would have visited it. So if we see in this illustration here, admittedly it's quite an antiquated image, I think it's the 1970s, you can just see the upper part of the amphitheater approaching into Pompeii. So it's something that people would have seen as they move into Pompeii coming in from the southeast, and it would have been quite impressive, you know, one of those sort of main structures that would have seen walking into Pompeii. So this is, as I said, you know, the location of it at the sort of far end of it, the less domesticated element of Pompeii itself. So these seem to be the two closest entrances to the theater, the amphitheater. Um, and this is how people, if you're taking from taking from the east, you would move in, and then this would be Main Street that you would take into the area of Pompeii. This is one of the streets named after the amphitheater. It's quite a wide street. You can see the amphitheater in the distance, and we can see the stairways going into the theater, the amphitheater as well. So this first view, most people who are coming in from that gate would see of the amphitheater. The other way you could enter in is here from the south. The closest obviously there's more entrances into Pompeii, but just to give you that impression. And then, or we could, and we just turn right up here and moving into Pompeii, the Via del Castello. This again a way into Pompeii. Now this entrance I think is particularly interesting because you can see there's almost a gateway going into the area of the amphitheater. Again, looking a little bit closer, if you can see there's some steps going into it. The roadway going into it from the area of Pompeii itself is quite narrow. So it is possible that this gateway could have been closed off as a way of restricting traffic going into the area of the amphitheater. I know a number of years ago I've read that people moving in and out of the area of the amphitheater was strictly controlled. Now, I think there's certain measure in that idea, but it doesn't seem to be true to life when you're looking at the more closely at the areas of Pompeii itself. This again, the gateway. Now there's a long stretch of pathway here going into it, but it's not as straightforward. You know, you can imagine if you had a large number of people, it's not the easiest way to walk in. But I'll talk again a little bit. There's another point I want to make in relation to that a little bit later on. We're brought into this narrow street area. There's not much, and I mentioned earlier on about the lack of building development in the area. Get a very clear image of that going into Pompeii. This is a walled area here into the Palaestra on the right-hand side, which again I'll talk to you a little bit later on. There are some residential dwellings over onto the left-hand side, but not many opening into this area. So it's quite a confined spatial area. There are three other routeways going into it. I want to emphasize the one a little bit in blue, which I'll show you towards the latter part. But I've showed you the sort of two main routes that I would suggest that people go into it. One of which, as I said, looks like it has a gateway, the other one doesn't. In this case, you've got a narrower street going into the area of the amphitheater. This other one, next street I'm showing you, on the left-hand side, it does look like a sort of a gate post, but that's actually not. That's a water tower to try and create pressure for water for the adjacent dwelling. But in this case, we do have what looks like a gateway going into it. So this is one of the reasons why people have suggested that there might have been some sort of crowd control element. Now, I think, as I said to you a little bit earlier on, I think there's a certain level of validity to that. But you know, if that is the case, you'd expect all the elements to be closed off. So I don't think that really works, but can't explain to you why that might be the case, why these elements are here. So as I said to you, less residential area, but it's quite a bit of an open space. And you have to see the amphitheater a bit more like a modern sort of football stadium or something like that. It's not used every single day. So as a space, it will be quite open and quiet. And I wanted to make the point here in this sort of rectangular area is to show that this is a wide open space that isn't really being used and would only have been used during times of the gladiatorial events. So as I said, this would be the main image that people would see as they come to the amphitheater in Pompeii itself. Now, I mentioned to you a little bit about, you know, that Tacitus was dismissive of gladiatorial events, but this was something that was, as an event, was open to everybody. And seating itself, like in the theatre, was strictly divided into certain levels of hierarchy. This just to give you an in sort of indication as to those sort of levels of hierarchy, the Imma Cavia, the media, and Summa. The Imma would be for those of the higher levels of society in Pompeii, I suppose, in terms of the political elite, maybe their guests. In the likes of Rome, this would have been for the patricians and the senators. The media one is supposed to be those of generally sort of designated as being free men. But I'm not sure if we can make that rigid division, but certainly it would have been those that, maybe just perhaps getting it of a higher level of society. And the one of the Summa up at the top, again, is sort of sometimes associated with those that might have been slaves or maybe for women or possibly even children. So, but clearly what they're trying to do is impose a level of hierarchy, whether that's a strict level of hierarchy in terms of people's social status, but certainly those in the front would have been those that consider themselves to be the most important. And we get an impression of that again, looking at it from above. And this is divisions that are made in terms of seating, which again, I'll talk about a little bit later on. So the idea in terms of numbers of individuals, you can see gets bigger and bigger as we move out. So, in terms of seating capacity in the amphitheater in Pompeii, it's generally sort of suggests it's between 20,000 and 25,000. So, substantially larger than the theater, but even the theater itself, its seating capacity of 5,000 is quite a lot of individuals. And it has been suggested, again, this is again something that's been dismissed, I think, over in recent years, that the population of Pompeii has been suggested based upon the amphitheater to be about 20,000, 25,000. Now, in some ways, that's a nice idea, a nice theory, but that assumes that everybody goes to the amphitheater. So that's not going to work because other people will be doing things during the day. Not everybody likes amphitheater, gladiatorial events. And there'll be also visitors coming into the town. But it was one way in trying to, people trying to estimate the number of people, the population capacity of Pompeii. So what I thought I'd do is to quickly run through how people get into the amphitheater in Pompeii to show that it's quite an intricate and complex building. So these are stairs, as you can see, taking up into the upper levels of Pompeii. There's quite a number of these, which you could imagine is appropriate because this is where the majority of the population of Pompeii or visitors to Pompeii, those of the lower class or ordinary people would have entered the actual amphitheater itself. So as you go up the stairs now, obviously the purple, the not the purple bit, the green, the orange bit wouldn't have been there. But even if you look in the slide there onto the right hand side, you can see that there's sort of almost like a landing bit at the top. This is closer towards the fortifications of Pompeii, the grassy area. But when you get up there, you can see there's a bit of a space, which you could imagine quite a number of people there. So you need to have that space, but you're confronted by these respective arches. The arch, the higher arch here, if you move in through that, it'll take you towards some stairs. And these stairs will take you to the upper part of Pompeii, and you're taken to these sort of almost like sort of boxes, I suppose. Now, this is where I get a bit confused as to who would have actually sat there. You're given a wonderful view of the events that are taking place in the arena. And I was suggest this might have been a sort of special box and confinement for women, which quite could be quite an interesting theory, but you can see even looking at this slide, if you start looking at some of the details, now admittedly some of this is going to be reconstructed, is there's only one entrance into the box, the media box I'm showing you, but there's no entrance into the other box. At the same time, there's no sort of protection area in front of that, so I'm not really sure exactly what the function of that might have been. But clearly, because the stairs, it must have been for people to come in terms of spectators. Now, I do know that there would have been some sort of covering area of the seating area in Pompeii, but had the mechanics of how that worked. I can't necessarily see it from any of the images I've looked because it's not an area that you can get it to in Pompeii itself nowadays. But there may have been, some sort of class division here, but this, as I already mentioned to you, the Summa cavea might have been for the women of Pompeii, but then they're making this. So in reality, we're not necessarily sure of the exact designation between the particular sections in Pompeii itself. Um, the other one, the sort of more squat arches itself, is another way of getting into it, and this will take you in to the upper part in Pompeii. So this takes you into the main sort of seating area that you can see, the main sort of the Summa cavea that I mentioned a little bit earlier on. Now, you do get a good impression of, I show the arena floor, again, reiterating my theme about the Pompeii. This sort of indication is that there were two bombs that actually hit the amphitheater in September of 1943. A large crater was produced here in the southern part of it, and there was some sort of destruction of the wall itself. So when we're talking about Pompeii, we're not just talking about the Roman history of it, but we're also looking in some ways modern history of Pompeii and various conflicts that took place in the modern period. And this gets filled in 1948, but you can still see some of the damage to the amphitheater. So this is something to consider, when you're visiting the likes of Pompeii. There is more than just the history of Pompeii in terms of the Pompeians. You can see the entrance that I mentioned a little bit earlier on, the upper part of the seating area. This is from the arena floor. The other area to get into it didn't require to go upstairs, and this is taking you into the lower parts of the amphitheater in Pompeii. And you have these quite impressive entrances going into it, and you get in through these into a series of tunnels. So just try and make the point about, it's quite an intricate and complex building. So this runs through the underneath the seating area of Pompeii, and to the right hand side you can see some steps, and that will take you up into the seating areas. Um, this is obviously quite well, if you go and visit the site nowadays, it has been quite cleaned up a lot, and sometimes they show various displays in this area. But what I like about this slide is, unfortunately, again, you can't get into the seating area. It shows one of the entrances going into it, and you can see how complex it actually is, the seating, taking you in to the medium seating area. But this will also take you into the front seating area at the same time too. But you can see one of the entrances going into the front seating area here. Another image of that. So it's not that there's a literal division between people coming in from the ground level going into the amphitheater, but certainly you wouldn't proceed into the front area unless you're one of those sort of considered sort of special individuals. But this image here gives you an indication of one of the sort of divisions that are made in the front area. So it is separated, in most cases, separated visually in terms of where people would sit in the amphitheater in Pompeii. As I said to you a little bit earlier on, there is these divisions that take place in the theatre complexes, but this seems to be much more clear in terms of visually in the amphitheater in Pompeii. We do know from literary sources that people didn't move around with, and there were sort of ushers that sometimes moved people out of these particular areas. This is just an Italian soldier, again, just trying to make the point about, the divisions in the seating areas, and this is a group of Italian soldiers, which then I thought was quite nice to show a group of individuals in the amphitheater in Pompeii. So that's the main sort of spectatorial area where the spectators would sit. Now, one of the things that I think is quite surprising when you go and visit the amphitheater in Pompeii is how easy it is to get into the arena floor. And these are the two main entrances going into the amphitheater. Now, this is the one on the northern side where I said this is the main entrance, and most people who walk into the amphitheater, modern visitors going into it. And you can see it's quite an impressive doorway going into it. I already mentioned to you that the amphitheater arena floor is cut down into the earth, so it's much lower than the ground level as you go into the entrance area itself. There was some early excavations that have done of that to suggest there were some earlier buildings there, but again, there wasn't extensive excavations that were done. But that does show that what this was something that was introduced a little bit later on. This reminds me of something I forgot to mention to you. The amphitheater in Pompeii is the earliest solid amphitheater, and it dates to around 70 BC. So it's the first amphitheater 20 years earlier than the earlier one I just showed you in Paestum. So this is said to is the main entrance that people will go into it. At the bottom of it, we have this inscription of this area. You take a sharp left, and the sharp left will take you into the arena floor. But on this inscription, you see the term spectacular. Spectacular is the term that is used for amphitheaters. The amphitheater is a much later term. So this is the terminology that they were used in the early amphitheaters. The inscription itself, you would assume this is where it was found, but it wasn't found in situ here. It was found in situ elsewhere. There were two of these inscriptions. I think one of them was found in this sort of tunnel. Another one I think was found in the exterior area. So it was removed for some reason. But this inscription refers to the individual that paid for this amphitheater. He was one of the ruling elite of Pompeii, and he sets it up in honor of the colony, as it suggests here, at his own expense. And much of the activities that are taking place are being paid for by the elite of Pompeii for their position, to emphasize their position of power in Pompeii. So this, we assume, was set up in about 70 BC. So this is the entrance I was talking to you there in the north, in the southern side. You can easily just walk into the arena floor. The southern entrance is similar, again, quite a steep walkway into it. But what is interesting here on either side of these alcoves, and below these alcoves, you have an inscription. These are inscriptions again coming from important individuals in the place of Pompeii. And this seems to be has been suggested that this was set up in around, I think it was 62 AD as a result of the earthquake. They were doing some sort of renovations to it because of the destruction of the amphitheater, but there is nothing here to suggest that dating evidence for this. Now, what's nice about this is they're parallel each other, one side and the other side, and one refers to the father, the other refers to the son. The other thing that's quite interesting about this is it has these little slots in there, which might have been some sort of protection for a statue that was placed in these alcoves. The earlier suggestion is that this might have been for the statues of these two individuals, but it might also have been for something else of more ritualistic aspect. But they did feel that there was some sort of protection necessary for that for whatever reason. And again, this is quite a steep walkway into it. And you can see what's different, at least in this one, is we have these slots going down into the arena floor, which I will talk to a little bit later on. At least I'm going to give you a suggestion as to what I think these particular slots, their role was in terms of gladiatorial events. To the left and to the right, you can see the tunnels that were connecting the seating. So they were interconnected, not just with the seating itself, but you could get into the arena floor from there. So it is very accessible. So it's not just very accessible for spectators, but also for gladiators to move in and out. What is interesting again is not just these areas of how you can get in and out of your seating, is you might see over towards a little bit further to the left, a small little doorway that has a gateway in front of it, but this is again showing you that entrance into it. But I'll talk about that little gateway a little bit later on. So this is the arena floor. It's always I find very impressive every time I walk into the arena floor about, all these seats around you and thinking about that might be 20 to 25,000 people there. So a lot of people were very interested in events that are taking place on the arena floor. When you get in there, some people wouldn't necessarily notice, but on the wall around separating the arena floor, on the pedestal or the top of that, you'll see there are inscriptions. And these inscriptions, again, like the inscriptions I showed you a little bit earlier on, are making reference to the elite of Pompeii, the triumvirate, the sort of magistrates of Pompeii. In this case, that they are paying for, rather than games and lights, the suggestion that lights means that there would have been gladiatorial events taking place at night. Um, Paying for the seating sector. So when we look at the amphitheater in Pompeii, we are seeing it in its latter stage of development. So it's possible that some of this would have been just grassy area, but the seating itself is gradually becoming more and more elaborate, and people are putting more money into that. But they want to commemorate that by having their inscription on the top part of the cap of this amphitheater wall. Some further examples of that. One of them is of reasonable interest. This is coming from one particular family, Icadius, and I think what's quite nice about this, I haven't been able to explore the actual link, is it might be linked into one of the main sort of dwellings just outside Pompeii, the villa of the Mysteries, which is just outside Pompeii. So it has been connected with that, and this is a possible family tomb that's outside a gate, the Herculaneum Gate. If you walk down further from the Herculaneum Gate, you'll eventually get to the Villa of the Mysteries. We don't know who this individual is towards the left, but this is a statue that was found associated with this family tomb or the Genus, which could have been him, but I don't have any evidence for that. But I think at least giving you a visual image of a possibility of an individual that might be associated with the amphitheater. So you can see this is located quite a distance away from the actual amphitheater. But Pompeii, for those who have visited, it's not a huge, sometimes labeled as a city, but I always feel more comfortable talking about it as a town. It's big enough, but it's still not massive. So getting back into the arena itself, we can see the wall, the surrounding area, and you might think, well, that's quite a plain space. And it's again something that unfortunately, when we're looking at Pompeii, so much of Pompeii itself has been lost through time. Now, this is a fresco that shows an activity that took place later on in Pompeii's history, but I don't want you to look at what's taking place in the actual arena floor, but to look at the backdrop of that. And it does show that this wall itself was decorated. And okay, it's in sort of rudimentary, sort of circular decorations. But when this was originally excavated around early 19th century, this it was quite elaborately decorated. You can just see up the bottom here, I told you about the inscription. This is the inscription here. So the walls of the arena were decorated with frescoes, and these are quite elaborate frescoes. Now, unfortunately, when these were first excavated, when they were exposed to the elements, there was a frost, and these were all completely lost. So we're very lucky to at least have these images recorded. But it's just one of those unfortunate things that shows a level of destruction about and the exposure of these images because of, as I said to you, exposure. Again, just making reference to one of those entrances into the spectators area. These are various different depictions here. So it's have these sort of figures of individuals. But what we also see is there's some images of some of the events that may have taken place in the arena floor. Now, this will refer to the animals that might have been part of hunts that were sometimes advertised in that. Now, it's more than likely these particular hunts were exaggerated, like this that shows a lion chasing after a horse of some shape or form. Um, I already mentioned to you about how easy it is to get into this arena floor, so I can't imagine it would have been a very wise thing to have had a lion loose in the arena floor. So it would have to be tightly controlled. This is just a recording, obviously translated into English about the excavation that took place on 12th of February in 1815. Again, making a description of what's taking place and what was seen here. This one seems to be a leopard rather than a tiger chasing after a boar. Another one here, a lion chasing after a stag. So again, it must have been very impressive, which you think is a bit of an odd thing to have in an arena where you would expect when you're looking at the likes of gladiators, an awful lot of unpleasant activities are taking place that would sort of dirty these walls. Going back to the point about if we're looking at sort of the animal events that are taking place, if we look at this individual here, who's obviously trying to get into the spectator area and obviously didn't know they were ever going to be used as part of a talk, is that the walls themselves are not very high. So even if you did put up a fence there, it's still not going to be entirely safe to have these wild beast events that have recorded on the outside. So probably these ones are more fantasy elements, but I'm not trying to say that it wouldn't necessarily have taken place, but it would have to be very tightly controlled. Um, Another element that people wouldn't necessarily see when they go into the amphitheater or miss this is a small little doorway to the side, which is this one here. And this is quite, I think is interesting, but also quite morbid, is known as the sort of the death gate. And it was suggested that when gladiatorial events were taking place, that if some gladiator, shall we say, passes away, they need to be removed from the arena floor. The suggestion is that they were dragged away into through this doorway itself to be taken off the arena floor to allow the safety of the other gladiators to butcher each other. So what's again the frescoes that have been recorded, this doorway is, I'm assuming it is the same doorway, although this one has a bit of an arch on it, is flanked by two gladiators on either side. So that might emphasize the point that this was the doorway to death. But looking into it, admittedly, I've not been inside. We can see there's a slope going out to the exterior, but at the lower part of it, there are steps. Now, I'm not going to try to pretend to you that I have much experience of dragging bodies, but it's not going to be very easy removing individuals that have been passed away up steps and outside into the exterior area. So I have my doubts about that, but I can't think of an alternative reason as to what these steps might have been used for. I did mention the small doorway over into the left-hand side. The function of this, again, is not really known. As quite a small space, and it was suggested that it could have been used for storing bits of equipment for gladiatorial events. I was wondering whether it might have been an area to go and put small animals into before gladiatorial events are taking place, but it is quite a small space. Again, it's one of those many unknowns we don't know in relation to the function of the various spaces within the amphitheater. We can see this on the southern part, again flanked on either side by these small doorways. So obviously they were significant and had an important use, but exactly what their purpose of, unfortunately, is unknown. These are the ones looking towards the northern part. This again, just one of the earlier images, which I quite like just to throw in for the sake of throwing it in. Now, I thought what I'd do is focus a little bit on the sort of animal element of this. We're just looking towards the northern part. And if you look through the archway of the entrance going into Pompeii, we were looking at previously from the other direction. You'll see a gateway at the end of this, at least the visual sort of narrative of the area. So it's possible that this area here, which was sometimes referred to this gateway, is the Forum Boarium, which might have been an area in which animals were kept. And the animals were kept here and then brought in through this entranceway into the actual amphitheater. Now, that idea has sort of lost credibility over the years, but I still think it's quite an idea because visually it does link between this part to the north of the amphitheater, this area would linking these two elements together, particularly the visual aspect. Now, this area was excavated much later than the amphitheater. It was in 1972, and I think when this first started excavated, you get an indication of the age from the picture of the car and this particular van. But you can see the excavation's been taking the clearing of the area, and the person who was doing the excavation here was a woman called Jezemski. The Jezemski was very interested in plants. If you look at the area in front of these individuals, you see all these little dots. You might think, well, what are these little dots? These little dots are plaster casts of plant roots. And the plant roots were associated with vines. And it's been suggested now this wasn't associated with animals. Were some animal bones that were found in this area. This is why it was thought they were used for keeping animals before the amphitheater. It was actually a vineyard. So that sort of dismisses that sort of idea. But I did say to you earlier on that it wouldn't have been for the dramatic animals we associate with the likes of tigers or panthers and stuff like that. But even still, I'm not sure, the actual dating as to when this became an actual vineyard. But what I do think is quite interesting is the location in terms of the gate for this vineyard and one of the entrances into the amphitheater in Pompeii itself. So you might be thinking about, okay, we're talking about the gladiatorial events. Well, where do these gladiators come from? There is a dwelling further away from the amphitheater. It's known as the House of the Gladiators, and it's been because it's been associated with gladiators. Now, this is not really that impressive in the exterior. Admittedly, some of the exterior decoration has been lost over time. And this is an indication as to what that dwelling looked like. You can see this large area, open area, the peristylum. The peristylum itself is that open area, quite a frequent element of housing architecture. Normally it's something that's beyond the atrium, but this is an open area. So the open area is a sort of dramatic entrance going into it, but you can see the pillars surrounding this peristyle area. And where the indication a link to gladiators, because there have been inscriptions have been found, scratched inscriptions rather than official inscriptions put into these various different columns. But it would have been a wide open area, which give plenty of space for people to be practicing in terms of gladiatorial combat. And this might be what was going on. The small rooms in the surrounding area would also have been useful for people to sleep in and storing equipment. So this seems to have been associated with gladiators before the earthquake in 62 AD. These are some of the columns that I mentioned, and these are some of the inscriptions that are associated with the gladiators. Now, they're obviously quite flattering. We have this one. Callidas refers to himself as being the girl's idol. He's a Thracian gladiator, and he's a slave, belongs to Octavius. Talks about his number of fights that he's had, number of wins he's had. We have another one lower down who refers to himself as a Retiarus, a person who fought with nets, and he talks himself as being a netter of girls at night. Again, sort of talking about how great he was. And another individual here talks about the number of events they took place. There's quite a number of these, and that's why it's been associated with gladiators. But when we get to the area at the time in which the earthquake takes place in Pompeii, this house of gladiators seems to have changed function and gone back into more domestic aspect. And the gladiators themselves moved. And they moved into the area that's known as sort of the gladiatorial Lundi, or the training area of gladiators, which is in the theatre district area. So as I said to you a little bit earlier on, I would return to that, and we're talking about this particular area here, the porticus. Now, in a conventional theatre, this porticus was seen as sort of area in which people could, during intervals, go into and relax. It's sometimes used as an area of displays of individuals' wealth. We can see this in the likes of the theatre in Pompey in Rome, where he was using it to show off the various sculptures and stuff that he pillaged from his various military campaigns and things like that. But after the earthquake of Pompeii, this changes its function and becomes the gladiators' barracks. And the small little rooms I mentioned into the House of the Gladiators, this also seems to be used as, I wouldn't necessarily say cells, but I suppose it's the best term to use, as cells for gladiators. The entrance into this is taking place, is very close to both the main theatre and the audience. So it's not really something that people would have been separated very dramatically from the rest of society. This is taking you into the actual area. You can looking at some various pillars, and you can see the theatre in the background. You might have noticed that there's a stairways here. The stairways will take you into the porticus here. So people would have been able to get into this gladiatorial barracks. People would have been able to see the gladiators actually training. Part of it has been reconstructed over the sort of on the western side. But again, this is much larger than the House of the Gladiators, a much larger space. The indication as to whether this is associated with gladiators, we have some inscriptions that are put onto columns. You get an indication of the sort of almost like cell-like of the lower rooms from the doors that are placed here. But there would have also been a viewing platform. So again, making that point that this would have been something that was very open for people to see when gladiators themselves were training. This room here was decorated with various frescoes that are associated with gladiatorial equipment. So this gives an indication and making that link to the actual gladiators themselves. You can see the top element here, I'm not sure what type of gladiator it is, was very typical gladiatorial helmet. On some of the columns, there were graffitis of gladiators. Unfortunately, the one on to the right has been lost, but it's at least it was recorded at the time of the excavation. The one on the left-hand side seems to be more part of a wall rather than a column, but there were some images of gladiators that are found there. But what was more important was in one of the rooms where these gladiatorial helmets and greaves were found. Some of these are more plain than others, and the suggestion is the more ornate ones would have been used for display, while the more less ornate would have been actually used for the actual physical combat, sort of showing you the comparison between the two of them. Whether that's true or not, I don't necessarily know, but they were all stored together. I've been given the impression that there seems to be quite a lot of freedom in terms of gladiators. Certainly, the graffiti that we see in the House of the Gladiators, and we talk about these gladiators talking about them meeting girls in the local area, seems to be a measure of freedom. But in this particular cell, we do find these things that would have been that would have been used to confine gladiators. Now, this might have been part of perhaps punishment for not doing what they should be doing. I don't know, but I still think it does. The gladiators do seem to have quite an amount of freedom itself. So there is another building that is associated with gladiators. Now it doesn't come across with the name, but this is where the gladiator barracks is, and this is where the amphitheater is. But it's located on the Via di Abbondanza. We're looking at the term, the name that was given, the Italian names given it. It's talking about Scolia, but this is for the youth of Pompeii. But more recent interpretation of this is that it was used for a store of gladiatorial equipment. Now, when it was excavated, as far as I know, there was no gladiatorial gladiatorial equipment was found, but it was an impressive building when originally excavated. It had this sort of very large open area, which this, I'm not sure how you describe the grill pattern sort of doorway going into it. This is obviously reconstruction of, but this is something that was quite close to what it was originally found. Um, but you can have elaborate walls, but it would have been an open space. But the interpretation in terms of the Pompeian youth would have been a more militaristic thing. I don't want to use the term Cubs or Scouts, but it probably is Scouts. It's probably the best, easiest way to go and sort of make a link to it. But more militaristic Scouts, or Army Cadets, that might be the sort of thing that they would meet here, and then they'll go and do their sort of marching activities in the Pleistra, which again I'll talk about a little bit later on. But some people are making the association because of the decoration on the exterior of this with gladiatorial equipment. Now, I'm not sure about this. They do seem to be trophies and militaristic trophies. I don't necessarily see the link with gladiators, but I thought I'd just mention to show those buildings that might be associated with gladiators. You can see these are a little bit of the images that were taking place, photographs taken when it was excavated, I think around 1912. They don't necessarily seem to be clearly gladiatorial to me, but a link has been made to that, and it's a reconstruction of that. It does have an unfortunate history. It was hit by bombing in 1943 and then totally collapsed due to heavy rain in 2010. And this is how it looks sort of ish today. So again, just showing the history of the buildings themselves and as a result of their exposure due to excavation. The other element of which most of us be most aware of in terms of the gladiators sort of advertisements to gladiatorial events. And these were normally painted on walls. It's the Pleistra I mentioned a little bit earlier on, a large wall which could be for very much a useful place to put graffiti on. And this is Pleistra and its location. The sort of rectangular area in the center area that the arrow is pointing is actually a swimming pool. The other arrow to the right-hand side is showing you an indication as to whereabouts this graffiti was found. And this refers to events that are taking place. It talks about that it's not just a hunt that's taking place, it also be athletics. And refers to sprinkles. The sprinkles themselves might have been cooling water, we don't necessarily know, but it gives you an indication as to the date in which these events are taking place. A gladiatorial event over 2 days. Why it says 373, people don't know, but it refers to this individual, and he's paying for these events that are taking place. Another one, this is on the Via de Abadanza, and this is the exterior of dwellings. Unfortunately, most of it's been lost, but again refers to gladiatorial events. In this case, he refers to himself as being, or the individual is referred to as being a priest of Nero, but eventually gets scratched out because of the death of Nero in 68 AD. So in terms of the dating of this, it goes back into around 50 to 68 AD. So I'm not, obviously it's quite difficult to give an implicit date, but if this is correct, and if say if we're looking at the early days and the Pompeii itself was destroyed in 79 AD, these signs would have been exposed for quite a long period of time for people to read. So they are a commemoration of these events that are taking place. This one is that not only just refers to the gladiatorial events I mentioned about the hunt, but also the awnings. So the awnings will seem to mean something important that people want to promote in terms of the events that are taking place. This is in the exterior of the women's baths near the Forum. Again, refers to athletic events and huntings, all parts of together. And the individual is emphasizing the person who's commemorating this wants to be shown as the sort of the leader of the colony. This in the main sort of forum area, this is looking down the Via de Abadanza, and again referring to events that are taking place, hunt and awnings, and giving a date as to when these events are taking place. This further down the Via de Abadanza, this is on a sort of a back street, I suppose, but still on the Via de Abadanza, just to give you an indication as to how it was found when originally excavated. Quite a lot of detail there. He refers to himself as being a priest of Nero, but in this case, you can see it takes place over 5 days. So quite an elaborate event to be paying for over 5 days. And going back into the early one that I showed you a little bit earlier, again referring to all the various different events that are taking place. You can see what has remained nowadays, very little, but as I said, this did suffer destruction as a result of the bombings in 1943. So This one here, they're all referring to events that are taking place in Pompeii. And this one is one of the few ones that seems to be in the main area of the city of Pompeii that's talking about an events that are taking place in Pozzuoli. So it's not just looking at events that are taking place in Pompeii, but elsewhere around the area of Campania. So this, as it's been put into an area in Pompeii, it's suggesting that people in Pompeii would have traveled elsewhere to go and look at gladiatorial events. Now, I haven't traced all of these ones, but it gives you an indication as to the area, at least the areas I've showed you, as to where these sort of gladiatorial promotional signs have been placed. So they're sort of a bit all over the place. Now I'm going to move outside the gates of Pompeii to the exterior of Pompeii to the funerary areas. And this is an area, unfortunately, you can't necessarily see nowadays because it's been covered over again. But the early excavations that took place, there are advertisements to events that are taking place outside Pompeii. And this one's referring to events that are taking place in Nolia. And this one here is referring to events that are taking place again in Nolia. So just based upon these sort of few examples, seeing that most cases for promotion and advertisement or gladiatorial events outside Pompeii are actually written on the tombs on the exterior of Pompeii. So whether that's um, fully the case because of the lack of remains, but is still quite interesting. These are the areas around Pompeii, just in case you forget where Pompeii is. All these areas are associated with gladiatorial events referred to in Pompeii. Um, this, I think, is quite an interesting one, but then when you start looking at it in a little bit more depth, it does become a little bit more tenuous, but it just gives you an indication as to the months in which events are taking place in Pompeii and elsewhere. Now, those who just want to scrutinize this a little bit more, obviously, there's no years in relation to this. So, although it gives the impression that gladiatorial events seem to be taking place in absolutely every single month in Pompeii, it isn't necessarily the realistic thing. Now, I'm not trying to say to you that the amphitheater wasn't used quite regularly, but I think this might be is giving us an exaggerated impression of that. But clearly, we can see from both the promotional activity that they are trying to get people to go be aware of events that are taking place. And these events themselves seem to be promoted at least 3 weeks before actual events take place. So these promotional things are associated with them, in most cases, with the magistrates of Pompeii, but certainly the political elite. And it's not just in terms of the promotional activity. We also see them wanting to have it commemorated on their actual tombs. Again, going back into the Herculaneum Gateway, we can see this tombstone. Unfortunately, much of the exterior has been lost. We can see gladiatorial events that are being commemorated outside here. So it's assuming that this individual paid for these events and wanted those to be commemorated on his tombstone after his passing to show what he's done for the inhabitants of Pompeii. So it's not just immediately that they want to promote these activities when they're individuals looking for a political office or in political office. They want to be remembered for this. So this goes against what I talked a little bit about Tacitus, that it wasn't the lower class are interested, the elite were concerned about and wanted to be associated with the gladiatorial events. This another tomb, this another gateway. But what's interesting in this case is this is a fresco of gladiators in the interior of the tomb. So it's again something that must have been significant to these individuals. It's not just the elite, but this case we have gladiatorial combats been depicted here on a street shrine. Now it's quite possible. Now the area which I've shown you where the arrow is, this wide doorway, this might have been part of a door sign. So it might have been a sign not referring to, or this scene might not necessarily be associated with the shrine itself, but given its proximity, I would suggest it still seems to be more than likely. We have the commemoration of some sort of sacrifices taking place to the right of this, and below this are some snakes that are associated also with LRAC shrines in Pompeii. But I just don't want to fully discount this as being a possible shop sign. But we do know that gladiators were part of shop signs. In this case, moving into the interior of a tavern, at least what's been associated with a tavern. And this is the image that I was using at the very start of this. Is we see two gladiators in combat. To the right, to the left of that, it's probably a person who would have been a referee of it. Unfortunately, it's fragmentary. And having quite a bit of a closer look at this, you can see the gladiator to the left is being quite victorious, whilst the gladiator to the right, with sticking his finger up there, is basically surrendering. But to show the graphic nature of this, which you don't necessarily see in some of the other frescoes because it's been recently excavated, and we can see the damage, the injuries in which this individual is suffering, with blood coming from these various wounds, which makes it look very dramatic. And you could imagine for the spectators, this would have been very dramatic for them to see. And we do need to move away from the idea that gladiators are all killed, but some of them did suffer. You can imagine these wounds here are not light, but it's expensive training a gladiator, so you don't want to lose these. So it's very rare circumstances. But the point is here, at least you can see some of the graphic nature of the gladiatorial combat. It's not something that you do, shall we say, for fun, so to speak. Um, Moving back outside Pompeii can show that what that one individual has done has recorded various different gladiatorial events and has also referred to the number of victories that individuals have had. So clearly the people, the inhabitants of Pompeii were very much involved with this, not just in terms of, signage and tombs, but also trying to record these events and through graffiti. This is going into the large theatre. You can see the passage of graffiti. If you ever go to Pompeii, do have a look at this wall, and you can see, and this is it's a long, narrow passage, and there's various different things that are depicted here. Some of these, I admit, you do need to require quite a bit of an imagination, but the depiction of two gladiators in combat. So this has been where people would have been queuing going into the theatre, or just people passing the time, scratching various different graffiti onto the wall. This is again how it has been interpreted. This one here, again, as I said, it requires quite a bit of imagination. But this case, you can see a more full aspect of it. Seems to be various gladiators associated with the number of victories that the individual have had. This one here, again, is associated with gladiators. I really don't see how that's to do with gladiators, but again, interpretation is everything in this case. And this is another one of a gladiator and an animal. So again, I have a bit dubious about that, but the point I'm trying to make is that, people did try to record certain events and were passing the time doing images of graffiti because it meant something to them. This is the house of the Calai, and in this case, in the interior of the house, we can see images just on the wall there. Two gladiators, and in this case, recording various different activities. And this refers to Severus, who is of free status. So he wasn't a slave and was victorious 13 times. And the other case, we have another gladiator, Albius, who's referred to as being left-handed. So something, again, of free status. So it's quite interesting. This is recorded in terms of graffiti in the interior of the household. More shocking one that's been found during excavations or renovations of the House of the Chase Lovers is this has been found. Various sort of sketches done in not charcoal, but in graphite, of what seems to be sort of done in a childlike hand, and certainly that's been interpreted as being, as a suggestion is that children would have seen these gladiatorial events. Now, this has been sort of a bit enhanced, but the link with children is the size of the hands as well. Admittedly, my images of gladiators wouldn't be much better than this, but the suggestion is maybe it's just taking things a little bit far, but the children would have been going to gladiatorial events and recording activities that they see, but it could be that they're going to see it in not necessarily in the amphitheater and seeing the actual physical combat, but might be seeing these training, for example. But the suggestion is that children would have been well aware of gladiatorial activities. Now, there was an event that does take place, which I think is in 52 AD, where a riot takes place between Pompeii and Noceria, which is one of the sort of colonies are quite close. And this is recorded by Tacitus, and the riot takes place. And as a result of this, some individuals get kicked out of Pompeii and they're banned from actually taking gladiatorial events. Now, the reason as to why this takes place, we don't necessarily know. Sometimes people make the association between rival football fans. Nasseria seems to have gained a colonial status a little bit after Pompeii, had some settlers in there, and maybe Pompeii lost a little bit of its status during this period of time. We don't necessarily know exactly the circumstances of it, but clearly there were rival groups between each other. And I did suggest to you earlier on that Pompeians would go to other towns to go and see gladiatorial events. So that's been recorded by Tacitus. But we have in this case, in this house, unfortunately, it's not very impressed when you look at the images of it. But the area in which the sort of red bit here on the wall, what was found in this peristyle area um, was this impressive fresco. To the left and to the right of it were depictions of gladiators in combat. Unfortunately, they were lost, but at least the middle bit was removed and taken away and has been preserved. And this shows the recording of that event that took place in that riot in Pompeii. It's not entirely accurate, but still it's an interesting depiction of the amphitheater in Pompeii. You can see the individuals fighting in the arena. You can also see people fighting in the area of the spectators, but also in the free areas to the left and right of the amphitheater. And you can see some individual, unfortunately, is lying down on the ground. So, and in this case, the plaistrum, which is the right area that I mentioned to you a bit earlier on, riots taking place at the upper part of it, which isn't very accessible. But it shows the graphic nature of the events that are taking place that have actually been recorded as a fresco. Up in the upper part of here, you can see this, they're taking place, combats taking place on the fortifications of Pompeii. What I think is interesting on the plaistrum, on the plaistra, is that there's graffiti that's been preserved on the wall itself and referring to both in Greek and Latin. And at least we can make those links to some of those earlier ones I showed to these individuals, these elite individuals recorded not just on that fresco, but also through the gladiatorial advertisements I mentioned a bit earlier on. Because I'm interested in shops, showing that this open area would have been used for retailing activity. Temporary stalls would have been set up there, obviously unfortunate on this particular day, but this area was used for retail activities during gladiatorial events. Now, that animosity is recorded in other things, but not as graphically as we have in the fresco. This is another area, quite an elaborate house, but on the wall of itself, you can see the reference here about the their victory over the Nazarenes and sort of gladiatorial events, and that they're commemorating their victory. Although these Pompeians were banned from activities, they wanted to show that they were being dominant. Now, anyone who's going to Pompeii, it's always important that you go and at least see the Luminaria, which is the brothel in Pompeii. And in the brothel of Pompeii, recorded on the wall here, is graffiti scratched onto the wall, and that refers to a victory over the Pompeians. So this is a visitor coming into Pompeii. There's a recording. Unfortunately, I thought I had the inscription actually translated, but it refers to the hook to the Pompeians. The hook would be used to remove the dead bodies from the arena floor itself. So that's some of the events and the competition that's taking place between different groups in Pompeii itself. So what I want to do is to try and sort of put all of this together and try and put in together some sort of aspect of a gladiatorial day in which events and activities are taking place in the amphitheater. We're taking to the Porta Stabia, one of the entrances I mentioned a little bit earlier on. So outside this area, you can see a seating area towards the right, known as a scolia, commemorating elite individuals, important individuals. But in recent excavations taking place, and it's been suggested that this is the tomb of Gaius Alius, who is referred to in a lot of the promotional activity, and his tomb has been suggested to be here. Unfortunately, it's underneath modern building, and they were extending this building or doing some sort of activities on it. This was discovered, and this is referring to an inscription that refers to that individual, and you can see how close it is to modern building. And this would have been his possible tomb. And it's this beautiful inscriptions that's been found on the exterior of it, a very elaborate, very fine inscription itself in the terms of lettering. And I've highlighted some of the key areas in relation to what I think are significant. Unfortunately, it doesn't refer to his name. So we actually don't know whether it is implicitly this individual, but it has been suggested by the excavator it is, and refers to the gladiatorial events that he's been in control of. 416 gladiators participating, very impressive. Talks about the number of events that took place, the animals all sorts of different activities that he's trying to commemorate and he wants to be recorded in his passing. It has been suggested from the inscription that he got the ban lifted, the 10-year ban for the riot early. So although people often said, well, there's 10-year ban, maybe there was sort of animal activity taking place in the amphitheater, but clearly there were events that were taking place, and it does seem that the ban was lifted quite early. So what was also found in this area and has been associated now with this inscription, but you can see it was found quite far back in 1844, this elaborate relief. And I'm going to use this relief to sort of recreate some of the events that might have taken place on a day of an event in the amphitheater. Now, this is in the museum in Naples. And you don't really sort of think about the importance of it until you spend time sort of looking at in terms of gladiators. So what I'm going to do is focus on this upper part here, and this I think would have been the start of events that are taking place in a gladiatorial event, and it would have begun with some form of parade. So the parade, and the central individual here in the toga is the person who's paying for that parade. To the left of him, you can see individuals are holding shields. The furthest one over to the left is holding a gladiatorial helmet. Now, these individuals don't look like gladiators to me, but they're certainly showing off gladiatorial equipment. To the right of that is a person holding a sign, which might be referring to the individual and what he's paying for, things like that. But it's all about promoting this individual. In front of him, we have this sort of like, I don't know, I can't think of a modern term, but almost like a float. Individuals carrying these. It seems that these are two individuals that might be working on tools, at least in terms of the thing, but it might have been associated with some of the guilds, but certainly does seem to be something significant this individual wants to promote. It might be related to some sort of deities. Again, we do see some of these images in terms of religious activities. In front of that, again, we can see it's all part of a musical event. You can see these trumpets been played, maybe a flute. So it would have been a noisy affair, again, trying to bring people's attention to the main individual who's paying for events. And behind him, again, talking about the flute, but this individual is holding a horse. And this, I think, is referring to this status of the individual as being an equites, which now, obviously less important in the city of Rome, but this is the highest level in the town of Pompeii itself. And this going back into those individuals I mentioned a little bit earlier on, carrying various gladiator equipment. And as I said, I don't think these are actual gladiators, but certainly they're trying to show off the number of gladiators, gladiatorial helmets. So these might have been the more elaborate gladiatorial equipment that I showed you a little bit earlier on to promote the gladiatorial events that are taking place. And this is just again from a different angle to show the high relief of this image. So if there is a parade and it's taking place from the gladiatorial training area, they have to get from this area here, possibly onto the Via d'Abadanza, past this the area I showed you about the Scolia Armentium that I mentioned a bit earlier on, to the amphitheater. Now, this is a rather sort of convoluted route and it's not really straightforward. So I don't think that there would have been an actual parade along the amphitheater for the reason I've showed you in terms of how you get into the amphitheater itself. So this is where I'll talk to a little bit about the palaestra, this wide open space. The palaestra would have been quite a good area to gather at the parade and move into the amphitheater. Again, a very wide open space, very easy to maneuver people around. This is one of the entrances going closest to the southern entrance into the amphitheater in Pompeii. I already mentioned about an open space, but this might have been an area where I told you about the sort of the militaristic youth of Pompeii might have trained. There are some sort of graffiti that are associated with gladiators there. Again, not really that many. There's a number of other types of gladiators. Again, using your imagination in terms of it might be a gladiatorial helmet. I'm not sure, but certainly this does look like a gladiator. Most of the entrances or exits do seem to face towards the amphitheater. So this would seem to show a link between the palaestra and the amphitheater. The palaestra is something much later, and this is built during the Augustan period. It was quite an expansive area. Buildings were destroyed to make this space, but trying to make a link to the southern entrance of the amphitheater in Pompeii is not necessarily straightforward. This is a look from the amphitheater outwards. You can see the palaestra wall. So it's not a straightforward link between the palaestra and the amphitheater. So I think that rather discounts the idea that people would have gathered in the palaestra and would have paraded into the amphitheater. So what I'm suggesting is that there might have been some small parade in the open area outside the amphitheater. I don't think they would have paraded from a gladiatorial area. They would have gathered in that area. Remember I mentioned to you about these yeah, that's what it was. This is the entrance, so I think that probably the parade would have gone through. And remember these little holes I mentioned, that would have been probably used to fence people off. So what I'm suggesting is, because we've got the alcoves on either side of the entrance, the individuals who are paying for the restoration of the amphitheater would have wanted this to be seen. And I think that this division was used to separate spectators from the main parade that would have come through this gateway going into the amphitheater area. The parade would have gone down, as I said, separated from the spectators by this sort of corral method. So, and that the parade area would have actually taken place in this area outside the amphitheater going into the amphitheater. There would have been spectators inside, but this would have been initially for people outside to go and see the people going into it. And also people going into spectators could have come out of this area to go and have a look at the parade that's taking place going in. So that's part of the emphasis of the individual, because he's not just wants to promote himself in terms of the advertisement, but wants to be very much part of the day. The earlier part of the day would have been composed of the animal events that are taking place, and this is referred to again on this relief, various different tastes. It's a very similar to some extent to what we see on the wall of the amphitheater, but in this case, they're not the impressive creatures that we see, like the panthers and lions and things like that. We can see these are individuals that would have been there to restrain or train these animals. This is an unfortunate individual that might have been sacrificed towards that. I don't know, but clearly there does seem it's not, shall we say, an easy job. But the main activities is going to be with the gladiatorial events themselves. And I've already said to you earlier on that at least we have one indication that goes over 5 days. The inscription that might have been associated is talking about 314 gladiators, very dramatic. So you can see the central area, gladiatorial activities taking place. The image themselves, this in terms of high relief, again seems to be very dramatic. And it does remind me of the one I showed you in the tavern associated glad, but in this case, we can't see the blood, but we can see the graphic detail and the activities that are taking place. In this case, you can see one unfortunate gladiator is at a loss, and the other case we have to the right hand side, one gladiator is talking to one of those people that might have been sort of refereeing the events. Towards the right hand side, again, dramatic activities are taking place. You can look at the abdomen of this individual, show the musculature, shows the detail that takes place. Now, and the dramatic sort of images in terms of the masks themselves, but these masks themselves do seem to be very elaborate, at least in my opinion. Towards the left, you can see a gladiator has been wounded, has been receiving treatment to his leg. Another gladiator towards the right hand again seems to be wounded. So it emphasized the point that, it wasn't necessarily about death, but certainly did suffer awful injuries. And then we have this image, which I'm not necessarily sure about what it is, but does seem to be one individual. It does look like a gladiator in terms of how they're dressed, but it's almost like they've been sort of strapped up or something by these individuals, or maybe they've just been carried off. But certainly somebody is in a difficult situation. So hopefully you will have learned some sort of new things in terms of gladiators, in terms of in Pompeii. Thank you very much and please ask some questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of them. If I can't, I'll just give you a sort of wordy answer for it.
Okay, thank you, Ardle. If you want to ask a question, I can put it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. So if rich people paid for the games, that means the people going into the amphitheatres, it was free to them?
It's sort of open to debate. I think that probably was, but I think maybe given the designation of seating area, maybe some people might have paid a bit more to go into the front area, perhaps not necessarily the front, but there
Yeah.
might have been some sort of payment. Um, but it does seem that it is free, just like the theater. But we know, I think, there have been some counters that were found that seem to be towards particular designated seating areas. That means that people would have been corralled into particular areas, but unfortunately, the evidence for it isn't necessarily clear enough. And then some people have been skeptical about what these actual counters actually refer to as nothing to do with seating areas. But we do know that in the likes of the Colosseum in Rome, that there are numbers over doorways, and you're going to put numbers over doorways for different reasons. I suppose you might go off to a toilet and not remember which is your doorway, but it might be you have a designated seating area there.
Okay, makes sense. And so I wasn't aware from all my reading that you could have gladiators in the forums and in the dining rooms. I know it's a long time ago, but so that was an eye-opener for me. That would have put you off your dinner, wouldn't it?
Well, it could have been eye opener depending on how close you were. But I
Oh,
suppose you need to think about, sort of like the widescreen TV nowadays.
how long would it have taken to walk to these other places? Because on your map, they seemed a little bit of a distance away for them to trek all the way over.
Not that long. It depends on how big the group is. But certainly I think about 15 minutes. I think from the theater to the amphitheater. But if there's a busy day, when I've been walking in Pompeii, it does depend on the number of visitors that are there. But I think it's very difficult to talk about the idea that there would have been a parade from the actual gladiatorial training area to the amphitheater, but they must have got there somehow. So I just think that they might have been mustered, shall we say, at least that's what I'm trying to suggest, in the area quite close to the amphitheater. But then again, maybe they just that was part of it. It's just I don't see the most convenient route going into it. It's been very straightforward to have a nice organized parade, but it might have been something that evolved over time.
Remind me what the difference is between an amphitheatre and an Odeon.
An audience covered over.
Oh, okay. Which one?
So it seems very easy when you say it that way, but I didn't know what it was myself. But the Odeon in which, what camera, what did I say, was the capacity about 1500? So it was
Yes,
quite dramatic that they were able to cover over that space.
right.
And in terms of the covering for the theatre or the amphitheatre in Pompeii, must have been quite impressive. There was a covering or awning in the amphitheatre in Rome, and I think Caesar covered over the entire forum of Rome with a covering that was painted with stars to impress people.
Okay, we have a question. So Julia asks, thank you for this talk. Was there a
Thank you.
special link with Thracia and the Gladiators? Having just finished A350, well done. I
Hmm.
saw evidence for Thracian gladiators a lot.
Yeah, it just seems to be that one of the earlier ones that, shall we say, the bad guys. So most of the gladiators were named after former enemies of Rome. So that seems to be the link more than anything else. In terms of there are different gradings of gladiators. As I said, to be honest, it's too complex for me to figure out. Don't know these things, but it really is just trying to form enemies. I think it's trying to psychologically show that ultimately the Romans are more dominant than the people that they've defeated and will continue to be there. So the Thracians were one of those sort of early enemies that were defeated by Rome.
So thank you very much, Ardle. Thank you for everybody for attending, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.
Great. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice.